for those not familiar with this platform. If you can't see the control panel at the bottom of your screen, please press the Alt key on your keyboard. That will give you access to the chat box, the question box, and the reaction buttons. We do enjoy seeing your reactions, so please feel free to applaud or hit the thumbs up to show your support. If you have any questions during the event, please pop these in the question box, not the chat box, because they'll end up getting lost among the comments. So any questions posted here, I'll ask during the Q&A session later. But please do feel free to use the chat box to share your thoughts, and we also encourage you to connect with each other, and we'll be sharing our own LinkedIn details shortly. For those not familiar with the Good Governance Academy, we're a non-profit organisation that was established by Professor Mervyn King in 2019. We collaborate with universities, business schools, professional bodies, and other organisations all around the world to educate and empower both today's and tomorrow's leaders. We run regular webinars on business critical issues, and if you'd like to see what we have planned, please head over to our events page on the website, which we'll post a link to in the chat window below. I'd also encourage you to join our mailing list and follow us on LinkedIn to be kept informed of future events. In addition to webinars, we host colloquia twice a year, and our 13th event will be held on the 15th of May. Registrations are open on our website for this now. These colloquia are high-profile events featuring prominent figures and thought leaders, and have been attended by thousands of people, so please do check those out. We also run showcase events to promote courses which the Academy has endorsed. The endorsement program is available to any organisation and involves a robust assessment to ensure the highest standards are maintained. The courses we endorse are those which address a broad range of governance-based topics and provide users with current and relevant content. Today's webinar is part of a series on the ISO 37004 and focuses on measuring governance maturity. Our expert speaker is our own CEO, Carolynn Chalmers, and although Carolynn is by right our CEO, by day she's an expert international governance advisor. Carolynn provides guidance to organisations of all sizes and types across many countries, and this makes her uniquely equipped to chair South Africa's Technical Committee on the Governance of Organisations. She is also a co-convener of the International ISO Working Group on Governance Maturity, and is currently editing the third ISO standard for the governance of organisations. You can connect with Carolynn on LinkedIn and also through the Good Governance Academy, of course. So Carolynn, thanks so much for joining us today. So it's a pleasure to have you here, and we really appreciate your time. Can I hand over to you now, and then I'll pop back on later on to field any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark, and wonderful to see everyone online. It's going to be a bit of a technical discussion today, so a bit of a masterclass, and as you said, a series of them. I did keep this one a little low profile, and I think because the videos will be available and the recordings, but it's really, I think, for quite a select few to assess governance maturity, but it really, we are seeing it is already a bit of a competitive advantage for many organizations. And I'll tell you a little bit about why that is so and what we're seeing around the world in terms of adoption. I'm just going to share my screen quickly, just to go through. You can see that, right, yes. Mark? Yeah, and I keep asking, but of course, you know, this technology works these days, so it's fine. So I'm talking to you today as the co-convener of the ISO, the International Standards Organization working group, and worked on and published this ISO standard. It's the first international standard for assessing governance. The technical committee at ISO is also working on indicators for governance, but ISO 37004 is a maturity model. And we sometimes talk about, if you want to understand governance at a point in time, you would do a traditional governance assessment, and then you get the results at a point in time. What the maturity model does is actually allows you to understand governance improvements or deterioration over time, and erosion of value. So it really is about more of a sustainability of the governance of the organization, as opposed to just the governance of organizations at a point in time. So I'm speaking to you on behalf of ISO. So you see that everything's branded as ISO, and the recording and the summary and the slides will be available to you after the event, as usual. ISO 37004, I will give a QR code at the end. It can be, it's purchased. All ISO standards, most ISO standards are purchased. And the reason for that is because there's a big engine going behind these ISO standards that ensure that they are always maintained and kept current. So it's your fees for paying for the standards that allow us to continually review and improve the standards and ensure that they're maintained and kept current. Now, in your various jurisdictions in your various countries, if your country has adopted the ISO standard, you will get a country-specific fee for that standard, and your country could change the standard to meet its own particular needs. In South Africa, where I am in Cape Town, we are in the process of adopting ISO 37004. So it will be then available on a South African rand basis, which for a developing country, that makes it far more affordable than having to purchase directly from ISO in Switzerland and paying Swiss francs. So a little bit of information about the maturity model itself. This is the first in a series, as Mark said, around the governance maturity models. And today we're going to be speaking about why measurement matters and what the business case is essentially for governance maturity measurement. And it really comes back to the history of governance over time. And last year we had the publication and launch of Professor Mervyn King's Corporate Revolutionary biography. And that really embodies where we are with corporate governance, is that we have really gone through a corporate revolution when it comes to governance of organizations. In the past, the governance of an organization was really, initially, when we weren't sailing around the world, was really just the shareholders, the investors, the founders of organizations, with their hands around the organization, making sure that their investments were realized. And over time, of course, we had the introduction of the limited liability company. We had separation between the shareholders or the investors and the founders of the organization and the organization itself, and we had the emergence of agency risk. I'm not going to go into too much detail around that. That information is all available in a video, that's a recording that's available on the Good Governance Academy YouTube channel, and Mark will put that in the chat for you to be able to, and please follow us on YouTube. And that's all available under the ISO 37000 standard discussion, with ISO 37000 being the governance of organizations. It looks and feels like your standard, your code, your regulations in your country, because it was largely an amalgamation of all of the international standards as a foundation. Beyond that, it is essentially future ready. ISO 37000 was published in 2021, and it is a normative reference for this standard. So this standard was written with 37000 in mind, and it is written so that you can take 37000 principles and then assess the maturity of that in your application through 37004. 37004 is written for all sizes and types of codes and regulations, and 37000 takes all of those codes and regulations to the next level. So it really is future-proof. We are going through a review process of that standard, and next year we start our review because it's a 2021 standard. This was published in November 2023. So we are already into our just over our first year of publication. We have got international adoption already. I've been helping organizations around the world already taking the standard and using it in the assessment of their governance practices. So the evolving organizational governance landscape has really gone from a boardroom of the traditional, old white men smoking cigars, having their whiskey, talking around on the golf course, to a profession where we have an international standard, ISO 37000, that really assesses, really provides the recommendations, the guidelines for the governance of an organization. So we've professionalized what it means to govern. And we see now in all of the new sustainability standards coming out, sustainability disclosure standards, that governance is a key component of sustainability. It is one of the determinants of whether an organization is going to be sustainable over the longer term. And providers of capital, investors generally, banks, etc., and stakeholders want to know that an organization is going to be sustainable. So part of that is understanding whether the organization's governance is future ready and future fit. So there's a change in the whole governance landscape has evolved. We can't go back to the 1992 Cadbury report and think that that is going to apply to today's world. That even the Cadbury report, as revolutionary as it was in its time, is outdated. The UK Cadbury report is, in today's world, certainly a foundation, but it has been completely outdated as this discipline has become professionalized. Some of the governance impacts that have affected boards and governing bodies around the world are just three of them that I'm picking up here. Is first of all, information security, cybersecurity, and technology. Here are two new ones. Just with the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, and here's the World Economic Forum's in Davos earlier this year. The global security landscape has deteriorated sharply in the last decade. Nearly 15% of the world's population now living in conflict-affected areas. In Africa, conflict is not something new, and in many regions around the world, but certainly in historically safe areas are becoming affected now, like we see in Europe and in Gaza. And then from Google CEO, AI is one of the most important things humanity is working on. It is more profound than fire or electricity. And I don't think that boards today have really grappled with this. Certainly, South Africa's now draft King 5 report or code that we in the Good Governance Academy had an event earlier this week on. You're welcome to listen to the recording on our YouTube channel. But that we spoke in that King 5 report, we spoke about there is a practice specifically on artificial intelligence and emerging technologies. This is going to have an impact on boards, governing bodies around the world beyond just technology and cybersecurity. Organizational purpose. There has been a drive around the world, and here are just some of the quotes that, and in fact, in ISO, we are busy writing a standard, ISO 37011, on purpose-driven organizations. And certainly the purpose of an organization has become understanding that, recognizing that, disclosing that, engaging stakeholders in the purpose of the organization, being held true to that purpose has become an emerging phenomenon around the world. So organizational purpose is a new thing for boards around the world, is a new governance practice for governing bodies around the world. We took it as read in our constitutional documents that our purpose was part of our shareholders' agreements, was part of what we submit to our company's house or our company's regulator, but it's so much more today. So organizational purpose and then being true to your purpose through generation of value is a new impact that has come through in just the last, since the 2000s, since the noughties. And finally, just to touch on stakeholders and sustainability, South Africa's governance codes, the King reports, really brought in stakeholder inclusivity. Back in 1994, we saw the World Economic Forum speak about stakeholder capitalism, but really, and even the World Economic Forum's manifesto is really about the purpose of a company is to engage all its stakeholders in shared and sustained value creation. And that is a significant statement from the World Economic Forum. And Mark Carney, who's of course now Canada's new Prime Minister, but used to be the Bank of England and United Nations, and he said to investors in an investor presentation, "You are the first generation of investors to understand to include climate risks in their considerations in their investments, but you are also the last generation that can do something to mitigate climate risks." And that's very sobering. And this is landing squarely on the shoulders of governing bodies. So, quick overview in terms of governance of organizations is not what it used to be. It has to change. It is changing. The boards of the past are not able to cope with what we have in today's world. So the role of ISO, the International Standards Organization, in fact, it's the Organization of Standardization, but it's written in French, so it's ISO. And the role of ISO is to look at standardization around the world in terms of facilitating trade, facilitating engagement, and promoting understanding across the world. I will go into a little bit more of that in detail and in terms of the byline right at the end in terms of ISO, but really it's about, in our discussion today, it's about facilitating trade and creating certainty in the economic context. Certainty when it comes to the governance of an organization. So why did ISO spend so much money in putting this standard together and publishing it? It's really because ISO believes that 37004 and an international standard for assessing governance maturity is required for equitable trade and certainty around the world. So this is a requirement for organizations, and it allows us to understand and compare organizations around the world in terms of their levels of maturity of the governance of the organization. Mark, I'm sure you're welcome to interrupt me if there are any questions, and just to everybody online, please, you're welcome to ask me questions at any stage. Can answer questions about ISO, about the changing governance world, but really now I'm going to dive into 37004. Is there anything you'd like to raise, Mark?
Not at the moment. We don't have any questions, but I'll dive in, don't worry.
I don't want to be preaching, but I'm so passionate about this, I could be preaching on this. So ISO 37004, I'm the editor of the standard, and it is an international guidance standard. So it's not a certifiable standard. You can't say you're certified on governance maturity. It is a guidance standard, just like ISO 37000 itself. The only compliance you have in 37004 is if you are certified in your ability to understand 37004. And we're busy working on a program that will allow you to be certified on ISO 37004. And of course, anyone doing governance assessments would want to be certified on ISO 37004. It is specifically for governance maturity. It is a comprehensive model, internationally agreed and accepted, for evaluating, comparing, and improving the governance of an organization. We don't talk about corporate governance. We talk in ISO as governance of an organization. And this specifically is a maturity for evaluating the governance of the organization. And it's the only international standard for evaluating the governance of an organization currently. Comparing the evaluation results and improving, comparing over time, and if necessary, comparing between organizations. But it's about giving that certainty to stakeholders of the governance of an organization and its improvements over time. So that's the intention, the purpose of ISO 37004. Who is it for? All types of organizations in any jurisdiction, in any country, no matter the standard that you're using for the governance of organizations. So no matter your corporate governance standard. So if you're in the public sector and you have laws that define what your governance duties are, the duties of your accounting officers, your executives, your political leaders, all the duties of care and diligence that you have as a leader, that can be assessed using ISO 37004. In private companies, whether you're using South Africa's King reports, whether you are using the UK Code for Corporate Governance, whether you're using a listing, a stock exchanges, regulations for the governance of organizations, you can use ISO 37004. I'm often asked about non-profit organizations or small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, and micro enterprises. And I am passionate about smaller organizations and non-profit organizations, the smaller entities, because I really believe that it starts there. I always talk about the successful plumber who then employed other plumbers, who then became a team of 10. And you can still put your hands around the organization, but it doesn't mean that you don't need to have governance. And really, it's about thinking differently when you are making decisions for the company. So here we've got, and I'll just use the example, Mark, of the plumber and his 10 people and how he can be more successful with governance of his organization, is that when you register your company, you are required to have a board and you're required to have directors. And that could just be you as the founder of the organization. But your thinking as the governor of this organization is about legacy building. And when you are governing this organization, you should be having a mindset of governing for establishing a legacy, sustainable growth, sustainability over the longer term, the viability of this organization, and everyone and everything that depends on this organization. That's a very different mindset from when you actually in the day-to-day activities, what joints do I use? Which new technology do I use? How do I send emails? How do I invoice? The day-to-day stuff. You deciding on how to do the organization. When you're governing, you're more thinking about what is the purpose of this organization? Where am I taking it to? And you really need to be in a more creative mind space when you're in that governing role. So it does apply to you. And people argue with me, oh, governance really isn't for the smaller guys. It absolutely is. It absolutely is, because we've seen it over and over and over again, how when you are thinking the longer term, when you're thinking about where you're going, how that really provides an impetus for growth in the organization.
Carolynn, can I just jump in there? Because this is something that we've seen when speaking to smaller companies, that they see governance as slowing everything down. So, if you're a growing company, governance has to be something that you come to later on when the organization's more mature. But what they don't understand is that if you have governance in place, it enables you to speed up. It's like brakes on a racing car. If you have those in place, if everyone understands their roles and responsibilities and your purpose and where you're heading, it enables you to reach those targets quicker. So this is a common misconception. I think it's something that we obviously need to address.
Absolutely, Mark. It's spot on. So I often use the comparison of the old acronym GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. And risk is really looking at, if you don't do it, and we know what the risks are, and of course the opportunities that are available. And again, that's a misunderstood area, is risks as, opportunities, as well as you have to take risk to achieve, exploit opportunities. But it's really what happens if you don't. Compliance is you must do this. Whereas governance is not about you must. And we use that word governance, far too readily about red tape. Oh, it's a governance requirement. No, if it's red tape, it's a compliance requirement. So governance is more than compliance. Compliance is the lowest acceptable way of doing something. So in governance compliance with legislation, that's society's lowest common acceptable behavior for an organization, for example. So it's what is agreed across the country as essentially the lowest, and you must do that. But governance is so much more than that. Governance is what you should be doing. So it really is, the putting the oil on the wheels. It's really making sure that you can go a lot faster. If it feels like red tape, if it feels like you're slowing down the organization, you're dealing with compliance. If it's governance and it feels like I've got certainty, I've got comfort, I know where I'm going, then you're into the realm of governance. So thanks, Mark. A very, very good and important point. So I'm going to run a poll now, if I may, and this is about what do you, if you're a practitioner and you are, let me just launch this poll. If you are a practitioner and you are assessing governance, why are your organizations assessing governance? What are their motivators? What are their drivers? Why do they want to assess their governance? And if you are in an organization and you are seeing whether this is working for you, why would you want to assess the governance of your organization? So I have opened the poll. Please have a look at it. It's multiple choice, so it's not only one reason in terms of why you would want to assess the governance of your organization. In our series, while we're doing that, in this series of webinars, I will be going in a little bit more into, Mark, the benefits of governance and how through this governance maturity model we can realize more benefits and we can help the organization move from more of a compliance-driven, conformance-driven governance approach into a performance-driven governance approach. So that will come through in the webinars. I will be running these polls through every webinar, so we'll get the results and we can understand, given the audience, and we've got a good, over 100 people, so a good representation of people around the world in terms of where they want to, what are the drivers, and I will have a poll and we'll have the results available on every one of our webinars. And at the end of the year, I'll have an event where we can discuss the results of the governance maturity and adoption and the benefits that it can bring. But today we're having a look at why measuring matters. So I see, Mark, we've got a couple on the internal drivers here. We've got, I think at the moment, I'm going to end the poll now. So last call for action. If you finish your poll, okay, I've still got people filling in. I'll end the poll later, but the general kind of sense of it is that one of the drivers is, and it really comes to the tone from the top, and Prof. Bob Garrett's book, Fish Rots from the Head, it really starts there, is that you won't have a very effective, you might be ticking the box on a governance, maybe it's a compliance requirement that you need to assess the board's, the governing body's governance of the organization once a year. But really, if the chair, if the leadership of the governing body is not invested in assessing maturity, it doesn't really, it's a ticking the box. It doesn't really help anyone. So if the leadership is committed to optimizing and being respectful of every board members, every directors, every member of a governing body's time, expertise, and commitment to the board, if the chair is respectful of that, the chair would be wanting to optimize their capacity in terms of time commitments and their capabilities. So, Mark, that's a very important one. If the board is not respectful of the board members, you will see, and sorry, I use governing body and board interchangeably. For me, it means the same thing. It's just we don't always have boards, so governing body. If the chair and the board is not respectful of board members and board members' time, you're not going to have that commitment towards improving. The second thing is stakeholder confidence. And this is why sustainability disclosure standards are coming out with governance as being a part of the disclosures of sustainability, because the governance of organizations, if it's done poorly, can erode stakeholder confidence, and if done well, can improve the trust in a governing body and in the organization. So stakeholder confidence, building trust with, in ISO 37,000, we speak about member stakeholders, and that really is the shareholders or the members of a nonprofit organization or charity. So the shareholders, but not only, building trust with those that appointed you, that you are doing a good job, but also your investors, and that's where the sustainability disclosure standards come in. But also, if your customers and your suppliers want to know that you're going to be around. So if you enter into a supply arrangement that's over a longer term, 5-10 years, your suppliers want to know that you're still going to be committed. They're busy creating things for you. They want to know that you're going to be around. So they want to know that your organization is led well. So definitely building stakeholder confidence. The next is decision making. So assessing where you are will lead to mindful and purposeful governance actions. So when we're assessing and we're doing it properly with the right frame of reference, we can say, this is where we are and this is where we're wanting to be. It's not where an external provider comes in, you do a questionnaire, you discuss the questionnaire and tick the box and everybody moves on. And that is the most common approach I've seen to governance assessments. When it's done properly, in a mature way, we get the governing body really unpacking, the members of the governing body unpacking where they are and how they can do better. And it improves the unity of the board. It improves the transparency of where you are, this anonymous feedback on where you are. And no, we need accountability. If we don't have accountability in the boardroom, how are we going to expect that board to be accountable to the organization? So it really does improve decision making. Mark, I'm going to stop this poll now and just share the results to see where people are. So we see that we've got largely it's about efficiency and effectiveness. If we're really doing that, then what measures are you using to improve the efficiency and effectiveness on the board? Are you just looking at whether you have now implemented the practices that are required by legislation, regulation, compliance requirement, or are you actually doing what works for you and your organization? Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Well, me personally, I think the response that most people have given is probably what they hope would be the truth, but in fact is probably not the case. I mean, we see that boards only really do this as a result of mitigating risks and because someone's told them to do. So it's not really that they see it as a means of driving efficiency. That's certainly what you would hope would be the truth. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. I see that I need to speed up a little bit. So let me speed up. The other two that we talk about is really performance and alignment. So being able to benchmark where you were, perhaps the previous board, where there's boards are only appointed for a 1 or 2 year term, you're going to have a lot of churn. So you're wanting to understand that that churn isn't impacting on the governance of your organization. So you're wanting to see the governance of your organization and that the board stability over time. So this really will help with that, and also aligning with the purpose of the organization and making sure that the strategy and purpose aligns and the values align with the board's values. So there is that alignment so that we actually do what we say we're going to do, and we don't preach to the organization as a board and say, these are the values of the organization, and then we don't practice it ourselves. We say, oh, quality is a big value in our organization, but then we don't practice it ourselves as the board. So it brings that kind of alignment. And then, of course, non-compliance. If you are a regulated entity and you do have to comply with a governance code or standard, we need to understand that compliance and we need to assess compliance with that, but also understanding the risk that is associated with that beyond compliance. So we understand that there's a big gap between where the lowest common denominator is, which is the law or regulation, and where actually society wants us to be. And we've over the last 30 years, we talk about that as our social license to operate. Really, society can close the company down, that Starbucks was very much aware of when they weren't being tax transparent. society can close you down, even if you are fully legally compliant. So the risk of not having an effective governance environment is really one of the drivers. Okay, I'm going to move on then. So what are the benefits of using 37,000? So absolutely, it helps you improve efficiency, effectiveness, and governance behavior. So those are the three governance maturity aspects that it measures. So it's not only about, are you applying, have you implemented the practices that the code or the regulation tells you that you've implemented? That's one aspect. There's so much more to governance than that. First of all, is how is the organization approaching, how is the board approaching applying corporate governance principles? And the definition, and there is a definition in 37,004 that what is governance behavior? It's the behavior when governing an organization. I mean, it's a very silly definition, but actually when you apply it, it's quite far reaching. So it's your behavior when you're governing an organization. And your behavior could be that you open up the board pack at the meeting, you haven't read it, you're not interested, you're not engaged, you haven't thought about the decisions that need to be made. You just, or you're meeting there, you're part of a board where you are, really just there for the money. And, the longer we can make this meeting, it means that we need to set another meeting, which means another board fee. And we need to stop that. How do we stop that kind of behavior when we are only assessing whether you have got a code of conduct and you've got an audit committee and you've got minutes of the audit committee? It doesn't stop that kind of behavior. So how do we make sure that the actual behavior of the organization's governing body is the right behavior for the organization? So that is one of the maturity aspects that needs to be measured. And we currently don't have an international standard, any kind of standardization besides 37,004 that measures that governance behavior. And Mark, being in South Africa, it's one of the critical things, and it's certainly one of the ways in which South Africa's state capture of our state-owned entities was enabled, because we had very poor board behavior. And here is a standard where we can actually assess board behavior. The second, of course, is the effectiveness of the board. Now, that's what people want to assess, is they want to know whether the principles are being applied effectively. Are the principles actually working for the organization? But unfortunately, although we want to know this, what we actually do and what we actually assess, and I'm talking about all of the big, well-branded governance advisors and assessment organizations, they all look at this. It's really governance efficiency. To what extent have your governance practices been made explicit as documents? Now, that can be very, very useful. It's very important to actually explicitly say, these are our intentions, and then to communicate those intentions through your annual reports or whatever it is. But equally, for a small organization, it's equally efficient to say in a single meeting with the owner of the company and his 10 or her 10 plumbers, I'm communicating to you where we're going over the longer term. That's equally as efficient, because you're all sitting around the same table. You all remember the same meeting. Remember, I said 2 years ago that that's where we're going. This is where we are now. So whether it's in a code of conduct as a document or it's sitting in a room and discussed, that is about the efficiency. So unfortunately, we want good behavior. We want an effective board, but actually all we're measuring is whether you have that practice in place or not. And ISO 37004 gives us this breadth. So it promotes a culture of integrity and transparency, one of its other main benefits. So integrity and transparency comes through governance behavior. So there's levels of maturity that we're going to talk about in another event, Mark, but it's about, are you committed to adopting the governance principles? Are you committed? That's level 1. Have you adopted the principles? And then, do you know what they actually say? Can you remember them? In South Africa, we only had in King 4, 17, and in King 5 now, the draft, there are only 12 principles. 12 principles. I can remember 12 things. Well, sometimes, so maybe not on a shopping list, but mainly I can remember 12 things. Surely as a board, and you're governing this organization with everybody dependent on you, you can remember the 12 principles. And so that is your commitment to adoption. How many boards of directors can remember the governance principles that they're implementing? In the event earlier this week on Tuesday, Professor Bob Garrett referred to the UK Section 172 in their Companies Act. And essentially, it was 7 duties of directors. It's only 7. Can we not remember 7? So adoption, commitment to adoption. Then understanding what those 7, 12, 17 actually mean, and understanding the importance of adopting that principle. Then understanding how to apply that principle and how you are applying that principle. You can see that these are different levels of learning. We could expect, preschoolers to be able to remember to put their school uniform on every morning, although I know some don't, maybe my children. Or certainly we drill into them the 2 times table, etc. That's just adoption. Actually understanding why you need to do a 2 times table and why you need to understand maths. Now you're dealing with the primary school children. I don't want to learn this, and I need to understand that. Then actually applying it, you get into high school, and now you're applying your mathematics through algebra and geometry. You can see the levels of learning, and we need these levels of learning in our boards of directors today. Then I need to analyze. So I applied this mathematics. How did my application, how does the way I applied my long division, how does that compare with another way, somebody else's means or mechanism of doing long division? So looking at how we've applied our governance practices and does that compare with others in terms of how they are applying their governance, and are we achieving the same thing? Are we achieving the outcomes that we set? So another level of learning. And then finally, are we evaluating? Sorry, it's not finally. Are we actually evaluating? We're comparing. Did we do anything about it? Did we go back and say, are we doing any better because we've compared? And then finally, with all of that understanding, did you actually do anything? Did you actually improve? Did you actually say you were going to do this, and a year later or 18 months later or however long, actually did we do that? Now, one of my bugbears in being on boards or being on board committees is that we have the matters arising and things that need to be done from a previous meeting, but there's no history to that. We get the matters arising from the previous meeting. I would really like an appendix of seeing over time whether the same matters are arising on a regular basis. And that regular basis in a board context, when you're meeting 4 or 6 times a year, could be over years. Are we dealing with this issue? It comes back every 2nd year. Every 4th year, this issue comes back again. We haven't resolved it. And so this is about, have we really put it to bed? This then, if I just go back to the previous slide, and excuse me, I'm going to go through the animation. Having this ability promotes a culture in the governing body of integrity and transparency. So you can see how just this governance maturity aspect can promote that integrity and transparency. Right. The next benefit.
Carolyn, sorry.
Yeah.
Can I just cut in? Because I think what's sad is that in all other parts of the business, this is standard procedure. So any other practices that are going on, any other things that are being done, there's always these processes being carried out. But when it comes to governance, sometimes they might do the first 2. There might be some application of these practices, but there's never evaluation, there's never improvement, there's never kind of the analysis that's required. So this hopefully will help support that going forward.
Absolutely. The board doesn't have a budget generally. So the board has to go begging to the CEO for money, and the board's treated like a tick parasites busy feeding off the organization because it needs money to do things and to improve. And we have to change that mindset, because the board is, the fish rots from the head. The board is so important, and sustainability standards now are just showing us.
Yeah.
Next one, applying the governance principles and practices. It helps to apply them. And really, this is around, and we'll go into the details of this, it's in your own words as a board, having a clear statement of the governance principle that you're applying as an organization in your own words. How many times do we see, well, let me give you a case in point, Mark. It was horrific. Very, very well-respected listed companies on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, when the King 4 code came out, their governance statements were King 3 says that this, or it's a direct quote from King 3. So the board hasn't applied their mind. It was the company secretary or the compliance officer that just took last year's and applied it again, and the board just signed off on it. So this is about having a clear statement of the governance principle that you're trying to apply. Remember, we've only got 17 in King 4, we've got 7 in the UK, we've got 12 in the new King 5. 12 statements of how you're governing, what are the right things to do in governing your organization in your own words. Surely the board has enough time to do that. Then the reason or objective why are you adopting that principle for your organization? What is the reason for you adopting this? And then what practices have you used or are you using to apply that principle? So the principles are written using the word should. If principles are written without that in the assertive as a statement, so board should lead versus boards lead, that is more of a compliance nuance, because it's then board, you either lead or you don't lead. When you say should lead, it's more a question of, and how are you doing that? So how are you doing that is an explanation of the practices you're using, and that gives you the how are you doing that. The next benefit is that it enhances the reputation and trust. So how does the standard do that? Well, it's about the efficiency. And this is when we're talking about, these are the documentation, the meetings of the minutes of the meeting. And the documentation, so your governance intentions should be explicit, should be delegated, because it's not just the CEO in the meeting or the board delegating to telling the CEO what needs to be done. It needs to be permeated throughout the organization so that the leadership actually is realized through the organization. That's integrated governance. Those intentions are consistently applied throughout the organization, and there is continual improvement. So that it's not just about, I have a code of conduct, tick, and that's really the lesson learned in the US out of Sarbanes-Oxley. Right? It was a compliance requirement. You have a code of conduct. Excellent. Now we can hold people accountable against that code of conduct. Well, conducts change. Certainly the new Trump administration in the US has a very, very different code of conduct from the previous administration. Conduct changes. So we need to continually improve in terms of our communications of our intentions. And there, ISO 37000 provides you with governance components that actually make the practices explicit. We will go into this in a lot more detail, so I'm just going to whistle stop over this. It talks about governance frameworks. In fact, it gives you guidance on what a governance framework is and what information it should contain, what it looks like. This is the first international standard to ever actually explicitly tell you what a governance framework is. Now, I know that in South Africa, we have a person who has copywritten a corporate governance framework. Yes, that's great. It's his version. Has it been internationally adopted by countries around the world? 77 countries unanimously adopted governance framework. And here we've got, this is what a governance framework looks like. Governance strategies. Now, that's a new one. It's not just the organization's strategy. What is the governance strategy? What are your intentions for governing information technology, etc.? What are your policies to be able to govern the organization's strategies, the organization's strategies, and what are their performance results on the basis of those policies? How are you delegating? The charters being terms of reference and charters of and job descriptions and role performance requirements. And then how are you responding to these communicated delegations? We'll go through that in far more detail in another webinar, what these actually look like. And then just to summarize, Mark, because I would like to take some questions. So what are the benefits of 37004? Well, I've just gone through these. It helps improve efficiency, effectiveness, and behavior by having the 3 governance maturity aspects. It promotes a culture of integrity and transparency, specifically on governance behavior. It helps apply the governance principles and practices, and that's specifically on the effectiveness aspect, and then enhances the organization's reputation and trust. And that's through the efficiency by having its intentions communicated and implemented throughout the organization. Just a final word. Yes, this isn't only for 37,000. This can be applied to whatever your corporate governance code is, whether you're in South Africa and you have adopted or you're compliant with the ISO, with King 4, or you're in the UK, or you're in Australia, or you're listed on a stock exchange and you have to comply. This can be applied to that. So in summary, why measurement matters. Accountability. It ensures that the governing body can be held accountable. This is also something of a bit of a stumbling block. If you don't have a mature board, you don't want to be held accountable. It's like putting a budget and then being held accountable to your budget. It builds trust and transparency. It helps you with your strategic decision making. It helps you understand the choices that you're making because it's fact-based. It helps you improve, obviously, because over time you can set your targets. It helps you optimize your resources and certainly the board's time. And then finally, it helps you be compliant and it enables you to exploit opportunities in the boardroom to do things better. Our next webinar is on measuring what matters. So going into a lot more detail, and that is in June. Here is a QR code to be able to read, and there's a certain section where most of this content is available in ISO. Please scan the QR code and then you can have access to this. Mark, I know I went over time. I didn't think I had enough content for an hour, but here we go.
No, that's great. We still have just under 10 minutes for questions. That's wonderful. Thanks so much for that, Carolyn. We'll run through the questions quickly. So the first one is from Gavin. He says, as a GRC professional, when considering a particular single governance framework aspect, one may or should look at evidence, effectiveness, and performance. Given the 3 metrics required under ISO 37004, which are behavior, effectiveness, and efficiency, how would you use this ISO recommend approaching an organization assessment when one could conceivably have several hundred framework aspects to deal with, such as chunking groups of other approaches, particularly when this may be a board assessment or board time, and yet still remain in conformance with the ISO, even at a detail level?
So thanks, Gavin. And yes, Gavin has sent me through some fabulous questions in the past. Yes, Gavin, I appreciate your expertise in this. So we are going to have a webinar specifically on how to do this. This is really more about why we should be doing this. And the 3 governance aspects aren't about the principles. There's different dimensions. So the governance aspects, if you can think of those as columns, and the actual what you're assessing are the rows. And you're assessing the principles and the practices. And as Gavin said, those could be extensive. You could look at 155, etc., more. So you could really go to the nth degree. We'll go into how to summarize up and how to get an overall picture in the governance, in the maturity model. But really, we want in governance, it's not about being mathematically correct or being, the compliance. This is actually, effectively what it is. It's about what are the nuances? What are we trying to, it's more qualitative in nature, as opposed to, we might put a number to it, we might say quantitatively, but the board, when you come up with all of these results, if it doesn't really matter about the number, the number really is communicating you are kind of here. Is that where you feel as a board you are? Or have we misinterpreted something? So it's a communication and engagement mechanism. It's about mindful and purposeful application. That's why it can't be a certifiable standard, because it's not tick, tick, tick. It's not you're a number 5 on this, or you're number 3 on this. It's about, do we feel that this is where we are, and should we be improving?
Right. Thanks, Carolyn. The next question from Stephen is, are you able to share any resources on how to implement the governance maturity model? He's not been able to find much on this. And how do many board and governance reviews globally, how do many board and governance reviews globally and are looking to start using this as a framework? Oh, sorry,
yeah, are they?
My apologies. They're looking to do this and they're looking to start using it as a framework, yeah.
Absolutely, yes. Resources are limited. They are limited, and that's why we're doing this series of webinars about explanation. We will have some templates available for you to download. We will have, basically, we're using this, the Good Governance Academy, as an enabling channel. You're welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn or through the Good Governance Academy. Mark, you're welcome to put my email address in there, because we only have 113 online. So go easy on me, but I'm very happy to answer your questions. There's extensive debate that went into international level with experts around the world that went into creating the standards. So of course we've got some answers to your questions. They haven't been made into a technical report or guidance documents, but it is becoming increasingly imperative that this was needed, after a year and understanding what's happening over a year. In terms of adoption, many corporations around the world now, it hasn't been well communicated that the standard exists. And really, it's been the consultants that have picked it up, as opposed to the company secretaries or the governance professionals in various organizations. To date, the only organizations that have approached me have been very, very large, multinational, a lot in Europe. I haven't seen many. In fact, there's one company in my hometown that I've been working with that approached me about governance maturity. But there's still many questions around it, and that's why we're doing this series, Mark.
Okay, thanks. A question from Anne-Marie. How should organizations communicate their governance maturity and improvement plans to maintain transparency and trust?
So I don't believe that filling in the blocks in a template really does that. And it's fine. It has a purpose to explain something. But for me, in communicating with stakeholders, you are at a board level. And for me, the best communication mechanism that is available to us today at a board level is the voice of the board through an integrated report according to the International Integrated Reporting Framework. That framework is the voice of the board, and it has all of the content elements that you would want. So communicating with stakeholders on the governance of an organization should be done in the spirit of that, and it includes governance, in the spirit of an integrated report that tells the story about how the governance of the organization is helping the organization to generate value over the short, medium, and long term, creating, preserving, reducing erosion, how the governance of the organization is helping that. And then behind that, what your levels of maturity, what you're doing as a governing body to improve your ability to govern the organization such that it can generate value over the longer term. So it's the voice of the board is the communication rather than a spreadsheet checkbox. This is what we're doing. Is my recommendation.
Right. Anne-Marie had a couple of other questions, but we'll take those offline. So I know there's some others.
Yeah.
There's a couple of other questions, and I'll see what we have time for. Gary has asked, what can a board member do in issues around concern over governance at an organisation? The current action for the board member to resign on principle, and the SENS announcement is thankful for service, and the board member is moving on to other options or retirement. So surely there should be a full and open disclosure on the resignation.
Absolutely. So I think transparency and disclosure around that is so important. And we are starting to see it. The UK is starting to adopt a process which leads into governance professionalism. So have a look at our King 5 discussion open forum that happened on Tuesday. Have a look at the event page on the Good Governance Academy. Prof. Bob Garrett provided a statement there where he talks about that in professionalizing governing body members and making sure that your history follows you. Of course, you can be a rehabilitated director, like you can rehabilitate, companies that have gone into liquidation. Or business rescue. But really what we're trying to do is make sure that your reputation follows you.
And I think our final question, given the time, Stephen has asked, is the IFC corporate governance progression matrix for small and medium enterprises, which is put out by the International Finance Corporation, using ISO 37004? And are they similar?
Yeah, no, it isn't. And in fact, I peer reviewed that guidance document, a very, very good document. It was published many years before 37004. It's still applicable. It's still very relevant. And you can use them together. The IFC document really gives you some practices that are very useful to introduce over time as you grow as a small organization. 37004 doesn't give you any practices that you should be introducing as you grow or as you mature. It's about the assessment as opposed to providing you guidance on how to improve.
Okay. Thanks, Carolyn. With us coming to the end of the hour, I think that's all we have time for. There were a couple of other questions, but we'll answer those in emails directly, if that's okay. So I just wanted to draw the event to close. Thanks so much, Carolyn, for your time today. We really appreciate that run through of ISO 37004. Thanks to our audience. We really appreciate your support and participation. Remember to check out the recordings of this event on our YouTube channel, and we'll be posting a summary of it also on LinkedIn. We hope to see you at our next event on the 29th. But all that remains to say is thank you again for your support, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you very much, Mark.